this is Pastor Amy. Welcome back to More of Jesus. Today we're going to talk about gospel comparisons because there are 4 different accounts of Jesus' life and teaching and ministry in the New Testament canon. One is Matthew's account, one is Mark's account, one is Luke's account, and one is John's account. And all of these evangelists, as they're called, or gospel writers, seem to have a slightly different take on what actually happened when Jesus was living here on earth. You'll notice that there are some stories that are very similar, but have some seeming discrepancies, or the details are different. There are some people that look at these so-called, discrepancies and say, aha, this proves that the Bible is faulty, that the Bible is not reliable, that it's not true or authentic. And then the people on the other side, the Christian apologetics, come back in and say, no, and they defend and they say, we can make sure that these match. We'll make them match so that they're accurate and they all agree. And I just get my popcorn out and watch the debates. What is actually happening here is that these Gospels, these narratives of Jesus' life, were never intended to be a video transcription of what transpired. They weren't supposed to be like someone sitting in a court reporting room getting every word and every detail exactly historically accurate. What they instead are is a beautiful, rich, collective memory of communities of Jesus and the stories that have been passed down to them. So most scholars and historians, whether they're in the Christian tradition or outside of the Christian tradition, have dated these documents at about 30 years, between 30 and 70 years after Jesus lived on earth. And so what happened is this Christian tradition was an oral tradition for much of the first several decades. So these stories that transformed people's lives, they would tell to their faith community. Their faith community would tell to the next one, or to their children, pass on to the grandchildren. And they were also written down, and some of the earliest documents or sources that the Gospels we have now might have used, we don't have anymore. And so it's just this big collection of a collective memory of who Jesus was and what Jesus did. And the story that we've been looking at in Dinner Church over the past month, we have studied the account in Luke's gospel of a woman who comes and anoints Jesus' feet with her perfume, and in John's gospel of a woman who anoints Jesus' feet. And in Luke's gospel, that happens early on in Jesus' ministry in Galilee. In John's gospel, it happens at the end of Jesus' life, just before he's crucified, and it happens in Bethany. These cannot be the same 2 stories. So I'm going to pull up a chart here. If you are watching, you can see. If you're just listening, I'll try my best to talk through this chart. This is a good case study of a story that is in all 4 Gospels. And the differing details are actually really, really interesting. So first we look at Matthew and Mark. Matthew and Mark agree a lot of the time in lots of details. This is a story in Matthew that happened in Bethany, but at Simon the leper's house. And the woman anointed Jesus' head. It was during Holy Week, a couple days before Passover. It's an unnamed woman, and there's conflict. But this is the only difference between Matthew and Mark. In Matthew, the conflict is that some of the disciples start criticizing her. In Mark, it's some of the guests start criticizing her. Not a big deal, not a huge difference. And then we look at Luke. Luke is one of what's called the synoptic gospels. The 3, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are the synoptic gospels. They usually do a lot of agreeing. But in this story, like we said earlier, the events take place in Simon the Pharisee's house in Galilee, not in Bethany, which is geographically different. The woman anoints Jesus' feet, not his head. Again, it's early in Jesus' ministry. She is referred to as a sinful woman. And if a few verses later we realize there's a description of a woman named Mary from Magdalene who has 7 demons that are cast out of her, that could be the woman they're talking about. It doesn't directly say. And the conflict is with the host host of the home, Simon the Pharisee, is the one who criticizes her. No. And then in John's account, it's different than Luke. It agrees more with Matthew and Mark. It happens in Bethany, but not at Simon the leper's house. It happens at Martha's house. And the body part agrees with Luke. The woman anointed his feet. And this time, it's not 2 days before Passover, but 6 days before Passover. And it's Mary, the sister of Martha. Jesus' friends, this family Jesus has befriended, is the one who anoints his feet, not a woman with a sinful reputation in the community. And the person who criticizes her is Judas Iscariot. It's not some of the guests. It's not the host of the home. It's Judas Iscariot, maybe speaking for many of the disciples. We don't know. Now, here's what some of the Christian apologetics have tried to do. They've tried to say, okay, well, it's clear that this happened more than once. Right? That Jesus was anointed by a woman at a dinner gathering more than one time because the details are so different. So I think because of the geographic difference, some commentators, some scholars say this happened 2 different times. Some say, well, maybe it happened 3 different times because John's account has enough details that are different than Matthew and Mark's that could have been 2 separate occasions in Bethany a week apart. And Luke's account also describes. So maybe they're saying these are just actually describing 4 different events, not the same thing. That's why they're all true. Others say, well, instead of trying to say these are 4 different events, they try and wiggle around the details. For example, they'll say something like, okay, maybe it was Simon the leper's house, but then Simon got leprosy and had to move out of his house, and then Martha moved in. And so when it says it's in Bethany at Simon the leper's house in Matthew and Mark, and in John it says it's in Bethany, but at Martha's house, they're saying that's probably the same house. It depends who you say, whose it was. It had always been referred to as Simon the leper's house. Maybe Martha was living there now. And they try and harmonize apparent discrepancies and say, well, this really could all just be true. They're just saying it differently. It's semantics, right? I think that could all be very true. Maybe there were 4 different anointings. Maybe all these details do have ways to kind of do mental gymnastics to get around them. Who knows? But it seems unlikely to me because of how extremely unconventional this story was. This story was so bizarre and unconventional that this woman who had no business doing this and touching Jesus came and anointed either his head or his feet at a dinner gathering where she wasn't truly invited, and she was weeping and she was grateful, and that happened 4 separate times. That's really a coincidence that something so bizarre could happen 4 different times. Maybe, right? But when we look at this tradition and how it has been handed down to us, and we realize these are stories that come out of the hearts and memories, the collective memories of these apostles, of these disciples, of these people who walked with Jesus, whose parents walked with Jesus, or whose grandparents walked with Jesus, it makes more sense to say, this was such a powerful and moving experience for everyone involved that day, that everybody went and continued to tell the story and continued to tell it over and over. It's like when parents tell their children about how they met, right? Like, here's how your father and I met. I guarantee that in the beginning when you tell them that story, the details are slightly different. And 5 years go by, when you tell them that story again, you laugh and you remember something else and you think memories are funny. And you tell the story again, and 2 years later, you tell the story again. Maybe you're pressed for time, so you give a 2-minute version instead of a 10-minute version. And maybe the details might change. They might be different. Maybe even your partner will correct you and say, that's not how it happened. Remember, I was the one who talked to you first. But the point of the story is the same, and the heart with which you tell the story to your child is still full of the same love and emotion when you told it from the very first time. The point is that you met, you fell in love, whatever the main point of that love story is, it continues and perseveres. And in these stories, of the account of some woman. Was it Mary Magdalene? Was it Mary, the sister of Martha? Was it a different sinful woman from the community? Who was it? We don't know. But some woman at some point in Jesus' life was so overwhelmed with love or gratitude that she came and exposed herself by doing something unconventional, socially unacceptable, and wanted to touch Jesus, anoint his body with her expensive perfume, with the most costly thing that she had. Maybe it was for his burial, so he would remember those strong smells as he was hanging on the cross, and the love that she gave, that, hey, you made a difference in my life, don't forget it. Maybe it was early on in his ministry. We don't know, but the main essence of the beauty of this story is a woman with a grateful heart who comes and lavishly expresses her love, who's criticized for it in all four accounts. She's criticized for it, and who Jesus defends her and says, let her be. She's doing a beautiful thing in expressing her love and her gratitude to me. And that is the story that endures generation after generation after generation. And every single gospel writer that put ink to paper told this story in the way that was the most profound and transformative, and includes the details that meant the most to them, or that they had heard from their faith community. And we get a little bit more of who God is, which is what we need. Thank you so much for listening in. Feel free to subscribe to this channel, and we will see you next time.